From Brandeis University in quarantine, welcome to Recall This Book, a podcast that looks backwards to see into the future. Our idea is to assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events by looking at books that shape the world we inherited. Today, the co-hosts are me, hello, John Plotz. Hi, John.
Hello. Hi.
And Vincent Brown. Hi, Vincent.
Hello from quarantine in Cambridge.
Vincent Brown is Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He directs the History Design Studio and teaches courses in Atlantic History, African Diaspora Study, and History of Slavery in the Americas. He's the author of The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery from 2008, and the producer of Herskovitz at the Heart of Blackness, an audiovisual documentary broadcast on the PBS series Independent Lens. And most recently, he's the author of Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war, which just came out a couple of months ago, and we have the pleasure of talking about today. So maybe you could just start by telling us a little bit about the book and what you're trying to do, Vince.
Well, first of all, John and Elizabeth, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. I admire both of you and your work. And I especially admire the fact that you're even willing to do this during a quarantine in the midst of a plague. During which we're recording this now.
I mean, it's either that or talk to our children. So, you know.
Well, that's exactly, which is a fate worse than this.
Yeah.
Yes, or contemplate the fact that they won't talk to us.
Yeah.
Right. So I'll talk about Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war, and kind of how I came to write it. I conceived the book, I think, around 2005, but certainly after the initial invasion that constituted that phase of the Iraq War. I mean, I think of the Iraq War now as running on 3 decades from kind of the early 1990s through the present. But certainly there was the invasion in 2003, which by 2004, 2005 already looked like it wasn't going well. So I was thinking a lot about empire and insurgency and how it was that kind of ragtag, impromptu militias could be holding at bay the strongest military in the history of the world, perhaps. And so I thought about that as I was thinking about the history of slavery, which was my specialized field, and thinking about a whole series of insurrections that were staged by enslaved Africans from Suriname all the way up to New York City in the last third of the 17th century through the first 3/4 of the 18th century. And these Africans, many of them, were from a particular region of West Africa, then called the Gold Coast, roughly what's now Ghana. And they became notorious for staging these insurrections during this period, even though they had been slaves. And lots of people had thought about why. One of the reasons was because these people were from a particularly war-torn part of the African continent. And those wars, in fact, facilitated the slave trade. Oftentimes, it was European weapons that enhanced the scale and lethality of these wars so that they could produce more slaves for sale to the Europeans to staff the plantations in the Americas. But many of those slaves had military experience because they'd been involved in those wars, or they had experience in evading and defending themselves from other kinds of armies during those wars. And they didn't lose that experience, forget that experience, even though they were enslaved in the Americas. And sometimes they came together, even former enemies coming together in new categories of belonging because they spoke similar languages or worshiped similar gods or recognized similar kinds of political authority. And then they staged these revolts against plantation society. So these people, called Coromantes at the time, as I said, developed an Atlantic-wide reputation for military prowess. And one of the largest of these revolts was what is known as Tacky's Revolt, that occurred in Jamaica in 1760 and 1761. So I decided I would write about Tacky's Revolt as a way of exploring this larger diaspora of militants throughout the Americas that staged these revolts during the period that I was writing about.
That's great. So I want to pick up on one dimension of that. I'm going to read you and everyone a quotation from your prologue, which kind of encapsulates one of what I find the most exciting threads of this very exciting book. So you describe imperial advancement and enslavement during this period as I'm quoting, a borderless slave war, war to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, answered on the side of the enslaved by war against slaveholders, and also war among slaves themselves. And you link this emphasis on war to views of space and scale. And this actually connects to some of your other work, I think, both the mapping project and also the Herskowitz film, which I recommend to everyone, and we'll include a link to the trailer on our site because it's a really great movie, which is also kind of about how to rethink space through movements and through particularly the movements of empire and diaspora. So I wonder if you can talk more. You also say during the same section that warfare migrates and that you want to think about how across vast distances these wars within wars connected the constituent elements of empire, diaspora, and insurrection. So can you tell us more about how this makes us think differently about space and about maybe the Caribbean in relationship to the rest of the world?
Sure. One of the challenges of this project and with the subject that I started with is that it's inherently transnational, and it transcended the kind of regional units of analysis that we normally think of when we go to write history. So it didn't happen in one nation state, it didn't happen in one colony, it didn't happen just within one empire, it didn't happen just on one continent. So trying to kind of tie together this event, the slave revolt in 1760 and 61, with its roots and its routes and its reverberations became an inherently spatial project. And I had to think about how I was going to integrate the different histories that all pulled together into this one place in 1760 and 61. And so already I was trying to think about how I was going to map this history and think about how it is that, say, West African history featured in Jamaica, how it is that European imperial history shaped West African history even before that, how it is the reverberations of these actions by Africans in Jamaica then reverberated up to North America, back across to Europe, and then to some degree back to West Africa. And so already I was thinking kind of about this entire region through which these events played out, and I needed categories, units of analysis that were not the received ones for the kind of history that a lot of us have been writing. Now, I think this part might be relevant to the moment we're living in right now. I had already conceived my method of working as kind of like an epidemiological analysis in the first book, in Reaper's Garden, where one follows causal agents, right? What an epidemiologist would see as a vector, follows causal agents from one place to another and looks at how they adapt or don't adapt, fail to adapt to their environments, and how they have certain kinds of causes, certain kinds of effects in different kinds of environments as they move across space. So already that kind of epidemiological thinking that I may have inherited from my father, who is a bacteriologist and taught medical microbiology at UC San Diego for his entire career. I may have inherited that from him. That already was a part of my thinking. And I applied that to this book where it seemed especially appropriate.
Yeah. So I have one question, but also it's funny because you just posted on Facebook, we happen to be Facebook friends, a map of all the states and which states gave a lockdown and when, right? And what that could be predicted about the spread of COVID. So this is clearly something that's on your mind, and your mind runs in these.
It's the way I think. And like I said, my dad was a bacteriologist, and so he's had me washing my hands assiduously ever since I was a child.
Right.
So I would love to follow up, Vince, on one particular aspect of this, because I really loved the way in describing it, you talked about and this is something you unpack in the book a lot as well, the notion of the ongoing wars, wars of empire that then have a resonance in the war of, the war that is slavery and the war against enslaved populations of enslaved populations against their enslavers. But I was thinking about this question of the way that vectors get carried and the way that military training works as part of the story of how populations are able to mobilize against other populations. And I guess the 19th century version of that I'm thinking of is that a lot of the working class people I study, like in the early 19th century, like the Chartists, get their start out of radicalism caused by the Napoleonic Wars. That is, they get, people have to go serve for the British against the French. And that's actually what gives them the weaponry and the training that they need. So that's a very straightforward argument about like distribution of, forms of violence. Is the story like the story that you're telling overall, is it a story about that kind of unintended consequence too? Like, I mean, the ways in which one sort of war form kicks over and has an unintended consequence of producing a different kind of war form?
So certainly the story of unintended consequences was foremost on my mind, even when I began this project. And I guess, if we go back to the early 2000s and thinking about the kind of launching of the terror wars, one of the things that kept going back and forth in my mind was how during the 1980s, the kind of big Cold War period, when the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan and the United States was backing the Mujahideen, holy warrior rebels against the godless communists of the Soviet Union, right?
I remember those bumper stickers with the praying figure.
Yes, right. The Mujahideen were the good guys for Americans, right? They were our friends. Yeah. Even the Cold War icon Rambo, right, in Rambo 3, is fighting alongside the Mujahideen, right, against the Soviet Union, right? And so, like, in late 2001, when suddenly, it was the Afghans who had hosted Osama bin Laden and who were at fault for the September 11th attacks, and we were now at war in Afghanistan, and our friend had become our enemy, right? Yeah. I was thinking about those kinds of unintended consequences, where, in fact, some of the very people that we had equipped and armed and trained during the Cold War ended up fighting the terror wars against the United States. So that kind of relationship of collaboration and betrayal and warfare was already on my mind. And I began to think about these West African slave trading states who traded actively with European states for weapons to fight their enemies, and then would trade slaves often in exchange, right? Had been in some ways in collaboration with these European slave traders, right? But of course, the wars that were facilitated by those exchanges of weapons then had reverberations that the slave traders, that the slave holders in the Americas hadn't counted on. There were unintended consequences. So already that was something that I was thinking about. Now, I also began to think about the entire environment as an environment motivated, shaped, conditioned by warfare. Yeah. And that's where thinking about slavery itself as a state of war came in. And I had Olaudah Equiano, Gustavus Vasa, who we know better as Olaudah Equiano, who said in his autobiography, when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. And then he actually goes on to quote John Milton in the conversation between Beelzebub and God about how people who are subject to tyrannical authority can only return violence, hatred. They can't return peace if peace hasn't been given to them. So for Olaudah Equiano, slavery itself was a state of war. And this wasn't just a metaphor, right? He had been in Jamaica in the early 1770s when the island was still reeling from the slave revolts of the 1760s. So this was something that was kind of part of his real experience. So thinking of slavery itself as a state of war then helped me kind of understand the entire world as one in which war was the most important motivating factor for most of the actions that I described.
So Vince, actually, when you and I were talking about this in the run up to this conversation, I also mentioned how much I had enjoyed just teaching Orinoco recently. And that's another one in which the state of slavery is understood as potentially perpetual warfare. So Orinoco goes back to, it's like 1688, I guess. Is this, do you have a particular, do you have a kind of moment of origin story about where this new configuration of slavery is? Do you see, I really love that you quote, you mentioned the age of servile wars, that is this Roman period in which all these slave revolts occurred, as something that Europeans had on their mind in the 18th century when confronted with the possibility of slave war. But so do you have an analysis that puts this kind of slavery as warfare as being kind of woven into the nature of slavery itself all the way back? Or is it specific to I don't know, like the
Cattle
the
slavery.
American modern capital experience? Like, is it the Americas or is it just slavery in the modern age? What's the story?
So I do kind of weave this notion of warfare into my understanding of slavery as an institution. And in some ways, I'm going to admit to being a bit of a bad historian here, because what I don't do
You're
is
on
say,
tape, you know, right?
I know. What I don't do is say, here's an origin, a transformation, and a definitive end to this kind of phenomenon.
Right.
What I do is I say, well, where we think that we've got the beginning of one war and an identifiable trajectory for it and a definitive end to that war, maybe we don't. I mean, when we look at the kinds of conflicts that I'm describing, it looks to be war all the way down, where it's very hard to tell where things end, where things begin, where things end, and also where the divisions are between civilians and combatants.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'll say that I think that that's an artifact of having conceived this project as we were all beginning to think about the implications of the terror wars, in which, you know, it wasn't clear like who the civilians and combatants were. It wasn't clear where the battle lines were. It wasn't clear like which countries the war was being fought in, right? And of course, military theorists have been trying to come to terms with that as well and changing their own conceptions of warfare. So, you know, it's a capacious definition of war, certainly, probably too loose and too capacious for people, you know, who need very precise definitions and, as I said, precise trajectories for things. But it functions as a kind of optic for this book, so that once we see war in this more capacious fashion, we can see all these things as related to each other that had once been kept apart. And here's an example. So Tacky's revolt in 1760 and 61 happens in the midst of the 7 Years' War between Britain, France, and eventually Spain. And that is a global conflict that has often been called the First European World War, right? But mainstream historians of the 7 Years' War never really see Tacky's revolt as part of the 7 Years' War. And this is despite the fact that, you know, many of the more famous battles of the 7 Years' War, like the conquest of Quebec, were fought by people who then went to Jamaica to suppress Tacky's revolt. People who were involved in the conquest of Senegal or the battles in Martinique and Guadeloupe then sailed to Jamaica to suppress Tacky's revolt. So there are all of these soldiers and sailors, military officials who were involved in other parts of the 7 Years' War, who were then fighting one of the longest and most protracted battles of the 7 Years' War in Jamaica. And yet historians of the 7 Years' War think that's a slave revolt. And that's part of another history.
So can I ask you guys about a book from my period? This book that I'm holding up now, Civilizing Subjects.
Catherine Hall.
Yeah.
She's a genius.
She's a genius. Okay, good. That's my main question. Is she a genius or not? Okay. So I love this book, but obviously it's about Jamaica in like sort of the 1830s to 1860s period. But she makes this really interesting distinction. And I was wondering if it was helpful that, you know, she says that people were trying to, that those who were trying to manage empire thought of the empire as having colonies and dependencies. And dependent, like India would be a dependency in that term, because it's like those are the childlike natives who have to be managed. So it's a site of colonialism in the classic sense, and then colonies would be more like settler colonialism. And that Jamaica was this problem. It kind of dangled between the two.
Well, since, as you said, you know, 90% of Jamaicans during this time were enslaved, right?
Yeah, I mean, she's writing about the end of slavery through the middle kind of, you know, third of the 19th century.
For sure.
So it's a bit later period. So by the time, you know, her story picks up, most of these Jamaicans have been born in the island. They're no longer African born. It's a largely settled place. It's not in the same kind of turmoil that it's in the mid 18th century.
But they're not colonizers; they're colonized still.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So that's helpful. So you're saying that basically that, because I was actually thinking about how that sets up an interesting parallel, which you get in somebody like Thomas Carlyle also, between Jamaica and Ireland. Where Ireland and Jamaica are both these big problematic islands that neither allow themselves to be colonized the way that, like, you can imagine Canada or Australia being colonized, nor do they settle into the standard imperial relationship of India. but they're annoyances in 19th century.
Yeah, I actually can't remember exactly how Catherine Hall makes that comparison. I'm sorry, but to me, like the key distinction between, say, Ireland and India and the Caribbean is the Caribbean territories are utterly remade by European colonization in a way that Ireland and India are not. Kind of, imperialism, empire, and colonization is kind of an overlay, certainly in India, and I think in Ireland as well. Whereas, the populations of the Caribbean are largely replaced in the 17th century and the 18th century by European colonization.
You do get the Ulster plantation in Ireland also. That is, there is an attempt to remake it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But I mean, when you're talking about a population collapse in the Caribbean on kind of on a scale that you have in the 16th century, and then a replacement of that population by people born elsewhere, predominantly in West Africa, from a wide swath of territory from the Senegal all the way down to the Zaire River, it's a totally different story.
Right, but you get suborned agricultural production in both cases with what's seen as an inferior and arguably a racialized inferior population. Like the Irish Catholics are also seen as just like serving in these plantations. But yeah,
and of course, kind of when the British really get their plantations going in Barbados in the 17th century, they're using captives from the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. They've got Irish indentured servants working on sugar plantations. And it's not until they can replace them with Africans that they switch over to the way that it's customarily done by the Portuguese and the Spanish.
This is kind of connecting to the conversation we had with Ajanta a few weeks or months or years ago. Time has used all meaning.
BC.
About the way that capital makes what capital does about difference, and how capital makes certain kinds of differences and sort of needs to in order to be legible to itself, or in order for labor to be legible, and so on.
And that comes with its own unintended consequences. So to go back to the story, I mean, because 90% of the population in Jamaica is enslaved, that means all the people who are doing the labor at varying degrees with various statuses are also enslaved. So you've got all these enslaved people of relatively greater status, right? So you've got slave drivers who are supposedly they're managing other enslaved people for the benefit of the overseers and the plantation holders. But those drivers are, they're kind of ambivalent figures, right? So on the one hand, they're working on behalf of the agricultural capitalists, but they also have authority over the enslaved. And it turns out that many of the leaders of Tacky's revolt had been drivers before they became slave rebels, right?
And this is where you get into the question of this kind of category of Coromantee too, right? That is sort of seems to be partly, it has some historical roots in West Africa, but it's also kind of constituted through the movement across the Atlantic. And it's also partly a category that enslavers put on. I mean, and it was, it seemed as though some of these stereotypes about Coromantees were, they're warlike, but they're also super smart, and they have good dental hygiene, and they're, good for being in these key positions for various kind of reasons, right? So it's sort of this interesting way that I guess identity gets like mutually constituted, and then becomes the sort of category of protagonism in this war.
Yeah, and in this case, it's a category of belonging and identification and a performance that's constituted in, through, and by warfare. And so it becomes key to explaining how this war played out. So it's not just a question of, identity politics, right? And it's not just a question of a cultural identity, but it's a question of how the politics of identification are made in this context and what consequences and effects they have in the prosecution of these conflicts.
As a kind of agent of mobilization.
Right.
And then, Vince, isn't there the category of, isn't the maroon sort of a separate third category for you in the argument? Like, is that not so much?
Yes. I mean, so many of the slave rebels who initially kind of started resisting, if you can use that word, resisting British colonization of Jamaica when they conquered the island from the Spanish in 1655, and then went to the mountains and continued to raid plantations through the late 17th and early 18th century. A lot of these people wound up being from the Gold Coast. They were also Coromantees. By the 1720s or so, their assaults on plantations became kind of so frequent and so destructive to British enterprise that the British were engaged in a major war against the Maroons. Mm-hmm. And through the 1730s, it wasn't clear that the British were even going to be able to maintain their hold on the island. They thought they might lose it to the Maroons. Mm-hmm. So they ended up signing treaties with Maroons in 1739, starting from 1739, which allowed the Maroons to maintain roughly their autonomy in their kind of mountain strongholds, but also required the Maroons to police subsequent slave revolts, right, which they did. Mm-hmm. And so in Tacky's revolt, you find the Maroons are key adjuncts to the British military in their suppression of the revolt, even though many of them probably would have been Coromantese as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is why, important to me in the argument is the idea that you don't know as much as you think you know about the politics of the enslaved and the politics of anti-colonialism just by knowing the identity of the rebels.
Right.
Right? If you kind of know their culture, people have assumed that if you have an identity for someone, you kind of know where they're coming from culturally, you can largely predict their political activity. Mm-hmm. And I'm resisting that argument here. I'm saying even once you've got the category of belonging created, that is still going to be fractured and inflected by politics as they play out on the ground. Yeah. And the reason for doing that is to make sure that we understand the enslaved as political people as well, with geopolitical implications.
Yeah. That was sort of what I was meaning about this kind of symmetry thing. In a sense.
Yeah.
And I think, that approach, sort of the idea of being able to connect the dots that way, I guess I'm asking you, would you say that is a kind of artifact of historical description of previous histories, in the sense that it's sort of like, okay, we're going to kind of figure out who the actors are, and the actors become these sort of conflated, somewhat essentialized categories?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how to answer that, because I don't want to kind of tar, traditional history with, with too broad a brush.
It's easy for me. I'm an anthropologist. So.
I would say there was a kind of interpretive conceit that thought that kind of most of politics could be inferred by what you knew about people's cultural identities, and that's one that I'm rejecting. Okay. And I'm trying to leaven that with a strong dose of materialist analysis.
Right. Well, maybe materialist analysis is our pivot point to the other book that we wanted to talk about, which is The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, which also takes a war, both a war, but war also in the sense of class conflict that is racialized, and in that sense different from a lot of the Marxist analyses of the time. So
I love Black Jacobins. Black Jacobins was introduced to me as an undergraduate history student by my undergraduate mentor, Stephen Hahn, who now teaches at NYU. And he said, hey, you're just in slave revolt. I think you might like this. And I loved it. And looking back, I think one of the things I love most about it, and still love, is again, this sense that enslaved Black people were geopolitical actors, and that their actions had broad, world-changing historical implications. Now, I didn't think about this in a very sophisticated way at the time, but I've come to appreciate how much we are struggling against some of the kind of fundamental assumptions and conceits of modern thought, which, if you trace back to G.W.F. Hegel, the philosopher, who claimed that Africa forms no historical part of the world, there's this assumption that Africa is kind of a land before time. There's kind of a prehistory. And when you look back at the formation of the disciplines in the 19th century, you look at what historians thought they were responsible for. Mostly they thought they were responsible for the political decisions of elite actors, right, in Europe and North America. Like, history wasn't a subject that applied to Africa for the 19th century, really, through the mid-20th century. It's not really until decolonization that you get people thinking very seriously about African history in the same way you might be thinking about as European and American history. And so just this idea that kind of, Black people do form a historical part of the world, that their actions are sometimes radically consequential, was the thing that still sticks with me in that book. Now, there weren't many actors acting as Africans, right? Drawing upon their African experience in that book. That came much later.
Right.
And for that, there was a book called Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World by John Thornton that was initially published in 1992, I believe, that really tried to assert the importance of, again, not only kind of African culture, but of African history and historical transformation in the making of this larger Atlantic world. And that has been important for me too, to kind of pick up where C.L.R. James left off and combine that with what John Thornton asserted, which is that, these African histories also play out in certain ways in the Americas, and ways that you can trace, right? Sometimes, and this goes back to your earlier question, using fairly old school methods. Who did what, where, and when? Yep. Those were the fundamental questions that I started with. And it turns out that when you really ask them and try to answer them honestly, you can see African actors engage in their own diplomatic negotiations, in their own wars, then happening to be enslaved and pursuing different kinds of war aims in the Americas. And that, to me, I think picks up, the insight of C.L.R. James that these people have geopolitical visions and that their actions have geopolitical consequences.
Yeah. One of the things that really, the first thing that struck me about it the first time I read it was that the chapter in which he really talks about the motivations and the political actions of slaves in Haiti is called The Property. And it's this, very kind of ironic title and sort of Marxist title, right? Like this is the collaboration of, the setting up of the class conflict. But it's the sort of, the irony is palpable of having just where you're having this very strikingly complex and, layered sets of activities and motivations and mobilizations. It's in a chapter in which they're defined as, property and commodities by.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, which is appropriate to kind of Marxist analysis, right? Which is like, that was their role in the slave society. And what I hope historians are bringing to that now is the idea that they weren't just property, that their role in the slave society mattered, but so did those prior histories that they brought with them. Yeah. And
which
so
James
here you have
clearly aware of. Right?
Oh yeah,
James
I mean, it's
definitely
the property is kind of ironic in the title, right?
Yeah, totally. How has the book been received?
So far, so good. One of the most gratifying things is that I've done a couple of interviews for Jamaican radio, and I was on a call with a guy named Derek Black X Robinson, who for the last decade or more has been advocating for Tacky to be named a national hero within Jamaica, alongside Marcus Garvey and Bob Marley. I think Bob Marley might not be a national hero yet, but Marcus Garvey.
What does it mean to be a national hero?
So it just means you're recognized as a kind of, in the, I don't want to say pantheon, but you're recognized as one of the kind of major national heroes.
On the money.
Do you get a stamp? Yeah,
I think you're on the money, kind of you're in government documents and things like that. But, Black X has been advocating for this for more than a decade by walking from the site where the slave revolt started, Fort Haldane in St. Mary Parish, all the way down to Emancipation Day Park in Kingston. And he was on the radio with me, and he quite liked the book and has decided that he wants to use it also to create a tour of Tacky's Revolt in Jamaica. And so that was pretty cool to feel like the book was already going to be useful to someone for whom this history has been meaningful for a long time. So even before the historians chime in, I don't know how the historians are going to receive it. It's too early for their reviews. But even before the historians get to it, I know that some, activists in Jamaica have found the book to be of use, which is cool.
Yeah. You were telling me about a couple of reviews in England.
Oh yeah. So that was funny. So I got a review in The Guardian where the guy, it was an appreciative review. It was a positive review. Said that it wasn't a popular history, but it was an important history, which I thought was cool. And then it turned out that this reviewer was someone who was a special assistant to both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. And I felt like in some ways, like maybe, if he likes it, maybe I haven't made my animosities clear enough. But
you thought you were daring them, but they thought you were inviting
them. But I'll take all the readers that I can. So, I mean, it means it's reaching people that a book like this might not normally reach, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we're at the moment to bring in recallable books.
So this is kind of a simple one, and you don't have to recall it by going back very far. But I was thinking about Marlon James's Book of Night Women, which is a fantastic novel, which is about a slave revolt, but not just about a slave revolt. You kind of know a slave revolt is coming, and it's predicted at the very beginning of the book. But really, it's a kind of almost a Victorian romance where you are with an enslaved woman and the women around her, and you're really kind of taken into their dreams and aspirations, and how those dreams and aspirations are frustrated by slavery, right? And even kind of intimate dreams, sexual dreams, like the kinds of liaisons that these people envision that are utterly distorted and frustrated, and kind of just mangled by slavery. And it's a really fascinating book that doesn't start with the enslaved as non-persons and ciphers, but allows that kind of symmetry that Elizabeth was talking about, which is like, what if you imagine an enslaved woman having a similar kind of desire to a woman in a 19th century romance? And then you look at the effect of slavery on that desire. That leading up to a slave revolt just kind of, it makes it internal, it makes it psychological. It just kind of brings it alive in a way that historians often can't. So I would advocate everybody read that book alongside Tacky's Revolt, the story of the Atlantic Slave War.
Absolutely. So mine is going in a little bit of a different direction and sort of thinking about the space and scale questions. I just finished teaching a course that was partly about the Caribbean and the anthropology of the Caribbean and the way in which world systems theory of the 1960s and 70s, which is an incredibly powerful tool actually of analysis, but has this fairly static interpretation of the world with Europe at the core, and then these other places as periphery and semi-periphery. The book that I'm thinking of is by John Tutino. It's called Making a New World, and it's about the area that I've done a lot of research, which is the Bajío in central Mexico, and sort of saying like, what would you think about that as a world system, world economic system? And what does that do to our other views of things? And it reminds me of your discussion about Tacky's Revolt as part of the 7 Years' War. It has a similar kind of like tilting the view slightly in a way that kind of really reveals a lot and has a lot of both historical and political implications.
Oh, that's neat. I mean, so I don't know that book, but I still have a soft spot for world systems theory and world systems analysis, in part because of the ambition to see an integrated world. Absolutely, not to start with the nation state as the natural unit or container of history or the continent or the people, but to envision the world as being interactive and dynamic in that way.
Absolutely.
I very much jump off that.
Yeah, I think we can't forget too that like it was in contrast and explicit criticism of modernization theory that was hugely dominant, right? And that was very explicitly part of US imperial domination, right? I mean, the subtitle of the Stages of Economic Growth, which is kind of like the, primary text of modernization theory, is a non-communist manifesto.
Yeah.
And, Rostow was an advisor to Kennedy in the early 60s, right? So absolutely, and comes along with a lot of economic theory from the Economic Council in Latin America about the transfer of value that you've talked about really amazingly in terms of sugar and oil, Vince, museum a few months ago. But yeah, and I think like when I teach it now, students don't see that, right? They're very, it makes them very uncomfortable, right? But I think there's ways in which it can also be, the tilting is very useful.
Yeah.
And I should just say, just to give a little, so Tutino, I really like Tutino's book, but there's actually an article from quite a long time ago by Angel Pellerm called The World's First Economic System, which is about the Bajío. So Tutino does a great job with an idea that comes from Pellerm.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this was great, and I'm gonna pivot for a second to our credits. And first off, I want to thank you, Vince, for
thank you
talking with us on this.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. That was great.
Rainy and quarantini afternoon. Quarantini afternoon with no quarantini.
A quarantini. What kind of drink is that going to be?
I don't know. I've been using it.
What's going to be in a quarantini?
Event,
Come on, you've got to make it Coramantini, man.
Yes. Whatever it is, it has to have quinine in it.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely. Oh my God, right. The tonic for our times, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Recall This Book is the brainchild of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. We're affiliated with Public Books, and typically we're recorded and edited in the Media Lab of the Brandeis Library by Plotz, Ferry, and a cadre of colleagues here in the Boston area and beyond. Our music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy, Fly Away. Sound editing is by Claire Ogden, and production assistance, including website design and social media, is done by Matthew Schratz and Kaliska Ross. Mark DeLello oversees and advises on all technological matters. We appreciate the support of University Librarian Matthew Sheehy and Dean Dorothy Hodgson, and of the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. You can email us directly at ferry or at plotz@brandeis.edu, or you can contact us through social media and our website. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please be sure to write a review or rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast joy and comfort. You may be interested in checking out past episodes, including topics like love, deindustrialization, Polynesia, or some other angle altogether. Other episodes, which we're calling Recall This Book in Focus, include conversations with Samuel Delaney, Zadie Smith, and Mike Lee. And we're currently rolling out a series called Recall This Book, Books in Dark Times, where we converse with various partners about what books bring them comfort and joy in these cataclysmic moments. Thank you, and goodbye until next time.